Hey, welcome everybody to another episode of the Command Post Cohort. Craig here. I've got Andrew with me.
Hey everybody.
We are looking forward to talking some more about lessons learned as young leaders in combat this morning.
Yeah, I think Craig's got a good story teed up for us.
And we're going to talk a little bit about one of my experiences in Iraq as a young platoon leader. Want to go through one of the situations I found myself in that was really not something that we trained for. We talked some last week about training and being prepared for
Yeah.
those moments um, of decisiveness or a critical event that is likely to happen. And while we did that, I found myself in a scenario that was a little outside of what
Yeah.
I was expecting. And we'll talk about how I reacted to that and some lessons learned I had from it.
Yeah, because you're right, man. As much as we talk about how important training is, you can't train for everything, right?
Yeah.
You train for every scenario.
Yeah, so to set the stage a little bit, I was a platoon leader of a striker infantry company. So had around, so I had four strikers, and being infantry, we were plussed up before deployment, and we had, I want to say it was around 38 guys with me. This particular day, we had left our little combat outpost in one area and gone and picked up a another officer senior to me who was at a meeting at another base, and we had been out on a patrol before this, and we're coming back, and so it was essentially we were picking him up on the way back in to escort him and his vehicle back to our outpost because that's where he was stationed at. And the route we were on, all roads in Iraq are, experiences may vary. There are some that if you drive down, you're going to make contact, and there's others that you never expect it. This was one of those roads that, to my knowledge, the entire time the Americans had been there, no one had ever made contact on this road. It was uh, probably the first 2 to 3 miles from our little outpost.
Yeah.
It was kind of isolated, not a major thoroughfare. There was some neighborhoods, there was a little bit of industry, a college, but it was um, not a lot going on this road. Not a lot of bad guys want to sleep right there beside where the Americans are hanging out.
So you said this road had never made contact before. Can you clarify that a little bit?
Yeah, so we had never, or our American forces had not engaged with the enemy. So there had been no IED strikes, there had been no gunfights. There had been very little enemy activity in that area.
So, relatively, use that term very loosely, calmer, safer kind of road.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And retrospectively, it was that environment that kind of leads to a little bit of complacency, maybe, or you go out on a patrol, you get amped up. You may have already been in a gunfight that day, and then on the way back in, you're kind of calming down as you get closer to base because
Mm.
you feel like your base has a little bit of a bubble around it that's kind of the safe zone. And this was where we were actually coming back into what we felt like was our safe zone. And so as we came through there, um, we had an IED strike that hit right behind my vehicle, the actual vehicle of the individual we were escorting back in. And I remember I was a little confused at first because it felt like somebody had just kicked me in the back and pushed me forward. And I
Yeah.
was thinking, I mean, it really, the first thing that crossed my mind was like this was some type of prank or joke. Somebody had like a long stick or something and like pushed me over in my hatch because in the striker, you're like from the, you know, not really waist up, but maybe chest up, kind of sticking out of the top of this truck. And there's two guys in the back doing the same thing. And so it kind of felt, I was like, did they just push me over? And then within 1 second or less, you hear the boom, you see the flash, and so I was like, "Oh wow, no that was an
Mhm.
IED. That was not a joke." And
Yeah.
so as I collect myself, when we start checking on the other trucks and reports are coming in of what happened, what does everybody see, and it's one of those kind of chaotic moments, or can be, because everybody's trying to share information, and so this goes back to the training piece of how well can we communicate in a time like that, and find out that uh, the gunner in the vehicle behind me, that was actually a Humvee. That was not a Striker like the rest of us. They're a little bit more exposed. He took some shrapnel. And so we're now faced with a dilemma of, one, we want to find the bad guy. We want to find, who set this IED off and take the fight to them. However, now we've got someone wounded, and how do we take care of them? And what's the best medevac option? And
Mm-hmm.
for us, I can't take credit for this decision. I thought it was a great idea at the time, but it wasn't for me. One of my squad leaders calls up and says, "Hey, why don't we split our platoon? We can send 2 Strikers back with that vehicle, medevac him to our outpost. Approximately, at this point, we're probably a mile from there, so we're close. It's not like we're sending somebody all the way across Baghdad.
Yeah.
And the rest of us can stay here and try to re-engage and find who did this." And so that's what we did. I sent my platoon sergeant and one of the other squads to escort that vehicle back, while myself and 2 squads stayed looking for the triggerman. Or at that point, we didn't know what we were really
Yeah.
dealing with, but it was kind of a wooded area, um, some houses and structures around. So we sent them out to that. We start looking around, and I had one of my team leaders calls back and says, "Hey, I think I found something over here." And there was a little mat. There was the trigger device. There were like 3 cigarette butts where somebody had been sitting there smoking cigarettes, waiting on us to drive down the road. And so we're like, okay, well, we found where he was. Let's
Yep.
try to figure out where he is. And so we searched through that area. And interestingly enough, there was a restaurant about a quarter mile, maybe less even. It was very close to where this IED went off.
Mm-hmm.
And the kind of the restaurant style there's a lot of outdoor seating, a lot of on the streets. Like, they can, if you're at one of those restaurants, you can see everything that's going on that road. And so I went down there and I said, "Hey, I need to know who did this." I said, um, I kind of put on my negotiation hat of, how do I convince these locals here to side with me and to actually discuss who was the terrorist, knowing that there may be people sympathetic in that crowd to the cause.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I spoke with them. I explained that out of all the time we had been there at that outpost, there had been no problems along this road, that I had stopped there before, and they told me that security was good, and they told me, there was really nothing to worry about there. And I said, well, now there's clearly something to worry about here. And
Yeah. That's a
and I
change.
also, yeah. And so we had a discussion too about, there were some roads in Iraq that once they become so bad with IEDs, we would put up concrete walls along the side of the street to prevent any type of IED placement. And now, not that I had the control to set up concrete barriers all the way down a road because of one
Yeah.
IED strike.
Yeah.
I did have the conversation of, we don't want that to happen. That's bad for your business. Nobody wants to hang out at the restaurant that's behind the concrete wall.
Yeah.
And so this was all going on with half of what I was normally used to having out on a patrol. And something that's worth noting is, at that time in Iraq, there was a policy of a minimum force requirements. And
Yeah.
if I remember right, it was like you had to have at minimum 4 vehicles and 16 personnel. And that was to mitigate risk. That was purely for the best interest of U.S. soldiers on missions. It's a lot easier to stay out of trouble when there's more of you, as opposed to three
Yeah.
guys walking out by themselves.
Yeah. So I mean that's important to highlight, right? Like that's a policy that came down from the American commander forces in Iraq, to protect the American soldiers and all the international soldiers they're operating. So this wasn't like just like Craig decides this is what we're always going to roll out with, right? Craig's not violating his own policy here. This is
Right.
a
This
four-star
was
general policy.
yeah. This was a above what this was an Iraq wide
Yeah,
policy. And so I had just intentionally violated it by sending two of my trucks and half of my forces back on this medevac mission, while I chose to not just sit in the vehicles and try to secure the area, but to actually get out and be proactive. While we had one squad out searching, looking for the area we thought that the triggerman would most likely be in, and then I went to speak with everyone else because a big piece of the counterinsurgency is engaging with the local populace and
yeah,
talking and explaining things and asking them questions and seeing how you can work together. And so that's what I was doing before. And we were out there for a decent amount of time before we got the other two trucks back. Eventually, they did return and came back to us. But this was us adapting against a policy to a scenario that we really didn't train for. Usually in training, anytime we had to do a medevac, we were far enough away from a base that you were going to call for air medevac. You're calling for a helicopter. And then a few times we trained, we're okay, if you don't have air assets, you have to evacuate via ground. But it was kind of an all or nothing thing. Either everybody stays or everybody goes.
yeah,
But we
yeah,
but we found ourselves in this geographically unique location of hey, look, we're only a mile away. We can assume some risk here, split the force. We know that it's only going to be for a short time. They actually went
yeah,
ahead and spun up QRF for us in case they were needed. And that's our quick reaction force. So another platoon that was back at the outpost begins prepping, gets their trucks running, loaded up, and they just stay there with the trucks running in case we call for more help, basically.
yeah, yeah,
Um, and so, so one of the biggest takeaways I had out of that was to always listen to my team. The idea of that, which, and I guess I should take a step back first and say the results of this. One, we got the injured soldier back to treatment rapidly, about as fast as you can. He was okay. He was taken care of there at the aid station. And because we were able to, one, collect evidence at the site where the
yeah,
triggerman was, as well as engage with the local populace, I passed out a tip line card to every person over the age of about 10 at that restaurant. I passed out like 30 of these little tip line cards because I don't want anyone to be singled out, because I also have to realize there could be a sympathizer in the group.
yeah,
And we did that. And by the next morning, we had received a phone call with the name and address, location, and when to pick him up of the bad guy. And someone there, or someone who heard from someone there, decided it was worth it to call. They didn't want our attention at that restaurant. And so it was successful in we were able to divide and
yeah,
conquer, so to speak, and achieve a lot. And I think that all goes back to I had a squad leader with a good idea that while technically violated policy, it made sense and it was worth
yeah.
accepting that risk.
Yeah, I mean that was a pretty high risk decision. Right? Yeah, you might be a mile away from your cop, but you don't know exactly what's going on. You're splitting your forces on something you hadn't trained on. But at the same time, right, you have a fight that you have to pursue, and you have a wounded soldier. Yeah. this young soldier might have, come up with this idea, but ultimately, right, Craig, that was your decision,
Yeah.
right?
It, it's
So,
it's my name on the line if something goes
yeah.
wrong. It's his recommendation and ultimately my decision. But you're right, it was high risk.
But
The
like you were able to like kind of thoughtfully mitigate those risks, right? You could see and think through the problems that might arise. Well, there's a QRF a mile away, right, from the
right.
base. The other half mile, and then we'll be back soon.
Hmm.
And I'm sure you probably thought like, if we do go into this restaurant and we do get into a firefight, you're probably not running down the streets, right?
Right. Yeah. We're
There's probably a cutoff criteria or soon to be in your brain of how much fight
yeah.
you could actually take on.
Yeah, and I will say that being a striker unit, we had an advantage because we have more people to dismount.
Mm,
A lot of units in Iraq at the time were utilizing Humvees, so
yeah,
you really can only dismount 3 people for per vehicle. Well, I could dismount in 2 trucks more than most platoons and Humvees can ever with 4 trucks.
yeah, yeah,
Um, and so I felt that that's one of those mitigating factors that, but you're right, there was a limit of pursuit. There was going
yeah,
to be a point where, because at one point I had someone recommend there was a large forested area, and it's like, hey, we can get in a wedge formation and we can move them into contact and move through here. And it's like, you're right, we can. I was like, but before we get into that, let's let's start here. Let's make
yeah,
sure that we've exhausted all options first before we do that, because we are limited now, and I
yeah,
don't know if those trucks can get to me there. Um, and so there were a lot of those factors, and but it all of these actions that happened to me were kind of the culmination of that trust we had developed over time.
yeah,
We had gone through a lot of training before, and this was not, like I said, this was not our first time in contact, but this was still, um, I say relatively early on. I guess it depends on it's all matter of perspective. This was, we had been there a couple months. If I had to put a number on it, we had probably been there close to 6 months, which for a 15-month deployment didn't seem like we were that far along, but 6 months is a good
it's
amount of
a
time
long
to,
time in country.
yeah, to understand what all's going on and to be able to make those choices. If this was in my first 30 days, I don't know if I would have made that same decision.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, because I wouldn't have known the area as well. I wouldn't have been as comfortable directly violating a
yeah,
policy. But at the same time, I felt that at that point I understood the intent of that policy.
yeah,
And what I was doing was not violating the intent. It goes back to the difference between the letter of the law and the spirit of the law.
hmm,
And while I did violate the letter of the law, the spirit of it was to protect and to mitigate risk. And I thought
yeah,
that um, if I took everybody back on that medevac, I would lose the initiative with finding the terrorist responsible.
yeah, yeah.
And so I wanted to be able to do that to prevent future incidents.
And so, man, I think this is such a great example you've got here because ultimately, right, this comes down to trust,
Yeah,
right? Like first off, that young soldier trusted you enough to suggest that you split your forces um, and divide and conquer, right?
yeah,
And then you trusted all of the soldiers, right, to do what they know they had to do, right? So that other half that was going back to the base was going to do everything they could to get back to you as quickly as possible,
right,
and with the right stuff, right? And you trusted your young soldiers that were staying with you there in the fight to be able to understand the situation, right? The greater situation, right? That half the forces were gone and you couldn't pursue very much. And so I think that's a great lesson. That it all comes back to that. Right?
Yeah, no, it is um, on so many levels of trust there. Even to that, after this, when my commander was kind of evaluating how we did things there, it was he still trusted that we were doing everything inside of the intent of taking care of people as well as being proactive to try to prevent future incidents. And I think that a lot of times we as leaders, we have to show the trust first
Yeah.
before we can ask it. And it's different to say that, oh yeah, I trust that I'm going to let you do this when it's in training or it's in a controlled environment. But then when you are in the real world situation or something that is more high risk, to turn around and say, yeah, I'm going to send you to by yourselves, because in that moment I was not as concerned with me staying with those two squads. I was really more concerned with those two that I just sent, even
Mm.
though it is only a mile. What if there is more ahead? What if there is
Yeah.
additional, maybe there's an ambush set up there and this was just supposed to, this one went off too soon or something.
Yeah.
And, and so it was more of, I've got to trust that they can do this. They're well prepared. Just like you talked about last time, of knowing that they are technically and tactically competent and you don't have to worry about the little stuff.
Yeah.
And
I was reminded of the little duck feed, right? Like
yeah,
got it
yeah,
all covered down here, but all the while you're thinking of all these other scenarios that could happen to them and to you and to limits of pursuit.
yeah, absolutely. And it is one of those moments where you're trying to communicate with everyone all at once and be able to um, ensure everyone's up to date, and but at the same time not getting caught up in the weeds of the policy. Well, the
Yeah.
policy says we can't do this. Well, there's an
Yes.
exception to everything.
Yes.
Every rule has an exception.
Yes.
I used to joke about whose signature do I need, because no matter what the exception to policy is, usually there's a form and usually there's a signature at the bottom.
Yeah.
And when someone would tell me, well, we can't do that, I would just say, well, whose signature do I need? Is
Yeah.
it my commander? Is it the post commander? Is there a 4-star general somewhere? Is it the Secretary of Defense?
Yeah.
Somebody can sign a piece of paper that says I can do it. We
Yeah.
just have to figure out who, and then is the juice worth the squeeze? Maybe I don't want to go all the way to the SecDef just because I want to,
Yeah.
you know, do whatever it is.
Play sports on
But
Friday with your PT.
right, yeah, just because I want to have a football Friday is probably not worth going all the way to the commanding general for.
Yeah.
But there may be some things that are, and as leaders, we have to look at, just because someone tells me no, do I take it at face value, or do I
Yeah.
really go to bat for my team and say, no, my team trusts me to figure out the best answer for this, and I'm going to continue to push a little more than I normally would?
You can even narrow it down to your story here, right? Which is this. It's about problem solving.
Yeah.
So that IED went off, right? And you've got an explosion that just happened. You've got a wounded soldier. You don't know what's ahead, what's behind, what's on the sides of you. If there's going to be any more contact, but you got a problem, right?
Yeah.
So how do you start solving that problem? Well, you got a suggestion. You made a decision. Think through all the mitigation factors to split your forces, right? We want to go and get the medevac. Okay, so it's kind of solved that problem. These two trucks can go with the
Mm-hmm.
casualty back to the base. It's only a mile away. Now, how do we solve the IED problem? So you got out. Where do you even start? Well, let's start looking around where the incident occurred. Let's start moving out. Okay, well, here's the mat, here's the trigger wire, here's the cigarette butts, right? So
Mm-hmm.
you start working through how to solve your problem, right? It's the same thing you just talked about. Like, okay, whose signature do I need? How do we get to yes? What is going to
Yeah.
allow you? What is going to convince you, whoever you is that I'm currently in disagreement with, right?
Yeah.
Um, how are we going to resolve this issue? Is going to be okay for both of us, right? How do we get to yes? And that's the big thing I think for leaders, and a lot of people don't understand. You
Yeah.
know.
Yeah. And I think that I like the way you put it of, how do we get to yes? Because, you frame this in a business aspect. It could be just trying to achieve a sale. You're problem
Mhm.
solving.
Yeah.
Everything comes back to problem solving. You don't have to face IEDs in your business world to be able to relate to this. Yeah, we were trying to avoid that. But it is, how do I achieve the results that I wanted, and how do we get there? And there's not always going to be a very smooth recipe. It's going to be
Yeah.
a conversation, it's going to be a phone call. It's like, well, why is this department not performing as I thought they would? Well, let's walk down there and talk to them.
Hmm.
Let's solve this problem and figure out what we can do. Whose signature do I need? Well, maybe it's not somebody above me. Maybe I need some buy-in from one of my junior team leaders, and so I need to go down there and talk with them.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
um, and I think too, so in that scenario, one of my junior team leaders was the one who found that little hide site. I think that people forget, with wartime, there's still a lot of things you have to do to prove that someone's guilty. And so all of that was actually collected as evidence that went to court. And that is how that individual was convicted, is because they can test those cigarette butts and be like, hey, look, we found a trigger device by 3 of your cigarette butts. Those are, there's a little bit of police type work in there that um, was solved by someone junior than me. That was not me either. I tried to help facilitate this whole scenario and kind of be the guiding force maybe, but the reality was I had a lot of people on my team that were doing the right things and were high performers, that we could trust each other and
Yeah.
achieve the success while mitigating as much risk as possible.
So something else you mentioned, I want to highlight. So once you found right the trigger man, and you were near this restaurant, you went into the restaurant, right? And so I suspect that you went in there with your heart racing, adrenaline pumping through your veins. You got an assault rifle, right? You got 20 of your best buddies, and they got their assault rifles too, right? You're ready to come in there, and somebody you know and have worked with and trained with and lived with is injured now. So you were primed and ready to go pick a fight, right?
Yeah.
But you went in there knowing that if you came in there, flipping everybody's table over and sticking gun barrels in people's faces, that you weren't really going to solve any of that problem set, right? You're probably going to create more, because I'm just sitting there having my whatever the Iraqi version of eggs Benedict is, right? And all of a sudden it's knocked off by some guy and get an
Yeah.
armor, and I get an M4 stuck in my face and
Yeah.
questioning like I pulled the trigger. That's probably going to upset me, right? So you changed the way you were going to approach the situation, right? You went from negotiating from the business end of a rifle to, hey man, let's have a chat. This is a calm road. How do we get to
Yeah.
yes, right?
Yeah.
Here's my card. If you know anything, if you know anybody knows anything, no pressure. Give us a call, right?
Yeah.
That's an important distinction there.
And I think I'm glad you brought that up, because I think that was one of the biggest challenges um, on patrols in Iraq and Afghanistan, is
Mhm.
going from high intensity. You
Yes.
were just either, sometimes it's a gunfight, sometimes it's an IED, rockets, mortars, whatever it is. You're in a high intensity conflict, and within 90 seconds, you have to tone all that down and act like you weren't just in a gunfight, or somebody wasn't
Yeah.
just trying to kill you, and have a diplomatic conversation. And being able to go back and forth between those is a challenge.
Yeah.
And I'll admit, I didn't always do it the best, but I think that in this particular example, I was at least able to do it good enough to get the results. And there are there's so many times where, as leaders, when something happens that strikes an emotional response, we had someone who was injured, so obviously everybody's a little pissed
Yeah.
off.
Yeah.
But you have to recognize that not everybody in that restaurant had anything to do with it. Maybe somebody did, but we
Yeah.
don't know that yet. And so you have to, one thing I always stressed to my guys was, let's not create more enemies. We got
Yes.
enough. Let's not create any more.
Yeah.
And like you said, if we go over there, if I just show up and I kick your table over and yell at you and threaten you, probably not going to get very far.
Yeah.
As opposed to, I may still be like the little duck example. Under the surface, I'm pissed off and I want to kick your table over, but I'm not going to let you see that. I'm going to
Yeah.
let you see that we are a professional force. We came in here and we're going to explain to you the potential ramifications of this type of activity and how more people get hurt. Your business may suffer. There's going to be increased activity here. It's not what you want. It's not what I want. So let's find the bad guy. You help me, and everyone's going to be better off for it. But
Yeah.
that transition back and forth from high intensity to low intensity and having a conversation, it is a challenge. And that was, if I look back across what that deployment helped me do, that as a young leader, that's definitely one of the things that I got more repetitions than I would care for. But it is a skill that has served me well even outside of the military, of being able to take something that would elicit an emotional response,
Yeah.
stay calm, and just say, okay, you know, at the end of the day, most things in the business world are not life or death. And so you can
Yeah.
say, okay, well, look, this is not life or death. I'm going to stay calm and I'm going to walk over here and talk about it.
Yeah.
And then try to get to yes and figure out how can we solve this problem together and collaborate on this so that everybody's bought in.
Yeah. That's a great point. You have to be able to understand that there's a problem and understand that you know using that emotional response that you have isn't always the best approach, right? You have to stay calm, think about it, solve the problem.
All right. Well, that was one scenario, and we will through the course of this show we'll go back to other situations that me and Andrew found ourselves in, and try to pull out some of these little lessons and share them so that um, hopefully you can find some value and insight out of this and not have to live through it.
Yeah, thanks, guys. It's a great story, Craig. Thanks for sharing, man.
Thanks. Y'all have a good one. Appreciate y'all listening.